very much. So we will get a presentation later this afternoon from Daniel Cacciaro from the CITES Secretariat, who will tell us more about the mechanics of CITES. But today we're going to talk a little bit about the ways in which CITES operates and the ways in which FAO works with the countries, the member countries, to assist them in their management of fisheries, but also in the interactions with what is a convention of biodiversity, but also for sustainable use. Okay, so I think we'll work today to understand how FAO works. We will also use sharks and rays as an example. 21 years ago, when Saving Private Ryan was in the cinemas, FAO was already working on an international plan of action to understand how, this was through the Committee of Fisheries, how FAO would operate to assist with sharks and rays, recognizing that they were vulnerable to overexploitation. And at the same time, we have, through the IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, they're working on which species were most vulnerable to what would be the loss of those species, the loss of that biodiversity extinction. If we look at what's happened under CITES, there's very many different views about how CITES can operate to assist fisheries. But we can see before 2013, there were not very many commercial fisheries species under CITES. And since 2013, there's been more and more feeling amongst the membership of CITES, the country membership of CITES, that marine species and aquatic species can be listed if they're commercial. And CITES can offer an assistance, especially if they're highly traded species. And as you can see, that's 7 species of sharks and rays were listed, and then the last one, 13 species of sharks and rays. And now we are heading towards December, where new proposals will arrive, and the countries will again vote on what species to put under the appendices, and we will discuss that process and what it might mean for eels. So in the last 20 years, FAO has spent a lot of time working with the membership to understand what controls have been put in place and what mechanisms have been put in place for looking after sharks and rays. At the same time, even when this development of management has been going on, there's been an ongoing call from the biodiversity community about the danger of overexploitation of the sharks and rays and what needs to happen from the point of view of fisheries. So there's been a shift in the way things operate. Firstly, the country members have spent more time putting in management, and the environment community have been louder and louder in their calls for increased controls. This is important for you to think about when we're thinking about eels, because eels are highly migratory species, and they have many susceptibilities similar to sharks and rays. And we can see what's happened with sharks and rays and how we can, through our management, increase control over the species and increase the opportunity for livelihoods and incomes if we manage well. So how are we managing? And what are the key steps that we have to take into account? Firstly, we have to decide as a community what is threatened. And that's very important, because once you decide that a species is threatened, it comes under largely control of not just fisheries management, but also biodiversity management. Secondly, we have to make sure we put in the appropriate support for the management responses. And then we also got to make sure that if we're spending money on management, that that money is being well spent. It's effective in what we're trying to do. So let me go into the question that's very important to the kinds of discussions that will happen at CITES. Is a species threatened or not? And this is very important from the perspective that all around the world there's more and more controls going into the environment departments and controls on trade of species which are designated as being threatened. And here we can get some examples. We have CITES, but we also have the CMS, And then we go down to regional controls through, say, for instance, the EU, some of them in the US, the Endangered Species Act, and then we can go down to Australia. All the countries now are developing controls to make sure that they aren't trading in species which are characterized as either threatened or endangered. So what does it mean when you say a species is overfished, threatened or endangered? These are very important categorizations and they're very different. The basic rules that you have to think about when we're making these decisions is that we have to think about the intrinsic biology and behavior of the species. Some are very, very vulnerable because they're very late in having offspring. They have very few offspring, they're very slow growing, they're very easy to catch because of their behavior. And then we also need to understand what do we have in data that can show us evidence of the impacts that would make them threatened. For example, if it was fishing, do we have lots of information that show that they've declined, either through the space that they inhabit, or the abundance, or the size, and so on? And then lastly, what is the enabling system in the way of human and natural pressures? Do we have a healthy system? Do we have a good management system to look after them? Or is that something that's lacking? All of these things will come into play to deciding whether a species is in trouble or isn't in trouble, especially in the international agenda. We look at this from the fisheries perspective. This means you're putting on the set of glasses that most fisheries managers have. When we look, we know now that fisheries production globally is largely stabilized since 1996, and aquaculture now is growing. So at about 80 million tons, we're really seeing fisheries stabilize, not growing anymore as it used to. So it's not a developing industry. It's something that we need to manage and conserve. In fisheries language, we don't use the language of threatened and endangered generally. What we tend to do is understand where the stock is productive and healthy, and anything below that figure is seen as overfished. And here we can see since 1974, when there was 10% of the world's stocks overfished, today there's about 33% of the stocks overfished. So we're not on a good trend. We have to reverse that trend, especially with the requirements for food and livelihoods. In the fisheries language, let me walk you through. If this was a stock, and we look at the left there, this is the virgin biomass declining. Depending on the intrinsic nature of that stock, if it's very, very robust, or if it's got behavioral or intrinsic behaviors that make it very susceptible, we tend to think of a fish being overfished when its abundance falls from its virgin biomass to about 30 to 50% of its virgin state. That would be the most productive level for fisheries people to maintain that stock. However, it's quite different when you're looking at stocks from a biodiversity conservation point of view. And this is very important. When we look at, for example, a very well-known description of the status of stocks, the IUCN Red List, which has been around for many years, has many thousands of species listed, how is their language an interpretation of when a stock is in trouble? And as you can see, under the IUCN Red List, they have what's called threatened status. Either critically threatened, endangered, or vulnerable. And under CITES, they also have controls. Controls for species which are in real trouble, they put under Appendix 1. These are species which are very, very hard to trade. You can trade them, but only in very, very exceptional circumstances. Appendix 2, which is not necessarily species which are threatened, but species which we believe are either in trouble already or are very, very likely to get in trouble in the near future. And these can be traded, but only under special arrangements. And Daniel Kachoras will talk about that later this afternoon. And then we have Appendix 3.2, which are species which countries want more information on. Okay. All of the rules and regulations and mechanisms for deciding either in fisheries or in biodiversity for whether a species is in trouble, in other words overfished in fisheries terms, or threatened or endangered, are well described. You don't need to make these up. These are well documented, and you can take your information and put it against the rules to see if you qualify or don't qualify. So, are we ascribing conservation status in a clear and non-biased way? This is very important so that we get the right species being characterized as threatened or not threatened. Are we linking the prescribed species to management actions that are being implemented? And lastly, are we achieving the long-term outcomes that we want to achieve for the species that we have listed? So let's have a look at the comparison of how a fisheries person might look at a species group compared to, say, IUCN and the red list. Here we have the same stock. As you can see here, this is a stock where nobody's ever fished it. It starts to be fished, and in this case it goes below and starts to almost bottom out. It's not a good scenario. If we take, for instance, 4 zones across this area and we compare what the fisheries people believe compared to what the biodiversity people believe, we see some of the reasons why we get into the problems we get into between fisheries and conservation. Let's look at them now together. In A, that's the first column on the left, when the fishery has just begun, this column here, both fisheries. So this is where some of the arguments happen. Maybe in the early days, a lot was wiped out and we don't have data, so there's discussion there. We also have discussion here, because the data collected over the last 10, 15, 20 years, it might come from different sources. And then how do we put all the data together to have the argument of whether we can say the stock has declined to the level that would allow it to meet the criteria? This is very important for you, being put by the biodiversity conservation sector. You need to make sure that you can defend that you are keeping stocks out of this danger area where they meet the criteria. Let's have a look at the discussion that's going to happen now. Species proposals are being written at the moment, and they will be lodged by the 24th of December with the CITES Secretariat. We do not know what's going to come in. It's kept very private. Nobody shares the information. Some people do. For instance, this year we know we're going to get sea cucumbers, probably from the EU. We know we're going to get some actual number. After the 24th of December, we then have a period where the FAO will bring together all the experts, and we will look at these proposals and look if they meet or do not meet the criteria. And that's the advice we will give back to the CITES Secretariat, our own members, and all the CITES parties. Then the CITES Secretariat will make up their own mind and give their advice to the parties, and then the parties themselves will vote. This is very important because FAO doesn't say whether that should be included or not included in the CITES appendices. That is not the role of FAO. FAO is to make sure there's clear, honest, non-biased advice on whether it meets or doesn't meet the criteria. Whether it becomes CITES listed or not is a discussion for the sovereign states and the parties of CITES. That is their own discussion. And they might choose to list a species that doesn't meet the criteria, or they might choose to not list a species that does meet the criteria. That is up to them. That is their prerogative. However, the discussion of whether the species meets or doesn't meet the criteria plays a large part. Because obviously, if something is in real trouble, governments would like to make a move, an extra move, to try to support it. That to do marine science or to do sustainable management, you need good information. And the reason you need good information is you need to defend against people who are going to say things which might not be true because they want their own outcomes to be delivered. We've seen a lot of miscommunication coming into this process, and it's therefore very important for governments and fisheries departments and industry to make sure they have good quality data to defend against miscommunication. We see extremely... Today, 1 in every $3 is in overseas investment in developing countries. That means that the world of business and trade is changing very fast, and it's affecting countries like Indonesia, where many countries that have maximized their returns are now interested in your resources. And if we look at fish trade, for example, that was general trade, this is fish trade. 1976, international trade in fisheries products from developing countries owned about 30 controls, but when we come to the international controls like CITES, only about 20% were aware of CITES. So we need to get this awareness down, not just amongst the government, but also amongst the people. And when we talk about the traders, we can see that they have a much better awareness, and this is understood because the traders are more involved in international trade. Now, when we go and ask the same people about whether they think these controls are effective or not, obviously, when we get to the fishermen, they don't believe the international controls are very effective, but they do have some belief that the national controls are very effective. So we need to help to strengthen the national controls and build understanding about how to make the international controls work. And the traders, similarly, have more respect for the national controls for effectiveness than the international controls. So we all have got work to do. Okay, this last slide is to say to you that when we sit through our day-by-day work, we see that nothing much is really changing. And sometimes we can get despondent. We can say, oh, well, it's not really working. However, when we look at what's happened through the UN process, through the FAO process, through the Convention of Biological Diversity, IUCN and CITES, we can see that over decades there is a significant change in the way that we operate. So we should try to think more long-term about where we want to be for our future, not worry too much about the 3 to 5 year scale of project after project, and believe that we can make a big difference if we do our little bit along the way. So, getting management right is about getting the right species, getting the extraordinary management they need, because management costs money and we don't want to waste money on species that don't particularly need it. Management responses are appropriate and supported. In other words, they are useful for the country and they get support so the countries can deliver these things. We've heard from Fergus about how we're going to make the management plan operational. And make sure that we can and are making a difference by checking to see if what's working and what's not working and being adaptive to that need. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, it was really interesting presentation. Now, it's make our understanding about the role of FAO and FAO expert advisory board, and also information about the scientists